Hi, this is Ryan Wynn. So today I'm going to talk about Chapter 7, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA, as the acronym is known as. So just as a brief introduction, I'm going to talk about the role of the federal government in public education in the United States. Specifically, I'm going to talk about what the Constitution says concerning the federal government's role in education, as well as the relationship between the federal government and between state and local governments in terms of funding education for students. As the name of the title, or as the title suggests, we'll also examine the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, including how it was passed and the effect that it has had on public schools in the U.S. Finally, we will look at the reauthorizations of the ESA and how these laws have affected education in the United States. All right, so just a couple of important terms for this presentation. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESA, was a law, or is a law, that dramatically increased the federal government's role in education by allowing the federal government to provide funds for disadvantaged students. So, for example, since its passage, the ESCA, through the ESCA, the federal government has provided more than $400 billion to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Another term is the Improving America's School Act of 1994, or IASA, which was a reauthorization of the ESCA, and it was really the first federal law to really focus on standards-based education. So again, a clarifying sentence, the IASA focuses on states developing challenging academic standards, creating and aligning assessments for all students, holding schools accountable for results, and increasing aid to high-poverty schools. And the final term, which is probably the one that most people are familiar with, is the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which was another reauthorization of the ESCA, and this law even more dramatically increased the federal government's role in education. It did so by expanding school accountability, requiring all public schools bring every student up to state standards in reading and math, and focusing on closing the achievement gap that exists based on race, ethnicity, and language. All right, so first I'm just going to briefly talk about what does the Constitution say about the federal government's role in education. So according to the 10th Amendment, which was part of the original Bill of Rights, the powers not specifically granted to the federal government are thus granted to the states. Now, the Constitution does not say anything about education. Therefore, the Constitution does not provide any venue for the federal government to run a national education system. Therefore, education is the responsibility of the states. So that's why we don't see a national education system in the United States. Instead, it's a patchwork of laws, and all those laws are different depending on the states. So because of the 10th Amendment, for most of U.S. history, the federal government had a very limited role or no role in education. Over time, however, the federal government did develop, at first a very minor role, but then a much larger role through the issuing of grant money to the states. For example, in the 1800s, the federal government started to issue land grants to the states for the purpose of creating and adding to the development of public schools. Congress took this a step further in the 1860s by passing the Morrill Act, in which the federal government provided grants to each state, land grants, to establish colleges. So, just to summarize here, again, the Constitution says the federal government, the Constitution does not provide any powers for the federal government to provide a national education. The only way in which the federal government can actually affect education is through the issuance of money. Basically, the federal government passes a law that allocates certain funds to give to the states, and the states do not have to accept that money. However, if the states accept that money, then they have to follow the federal guidelines attached with that money. So again, while the states don't have to accept the money, that money is a very powerful incentive, for the states to follow those federal rules. It should also be noted that the federal government has never provided more than 10% of the total amount of money spent on public education. So again, despite all the federal rules that states are that usually follow, the vast majority of the money and the rules are provided by the states and local districts. All right. So the second half of the 20th century saw a lot more laws passed that provided federal grants, thus increasing the role of the federal government in education. For example, the National Defense Education Act, the Higher Education Facilities Act, and the Vocational Education Act. However, none of these increased the federal government's educational role as dramatically as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was passed in 1965 as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty. And what the ESEA does is it provides money to the states to aid disadvantaged children. And again, with that money provided to the states, there is federal guidelines that the states must follow in order to receive that money. The ESEA needs to be reauthorized every several years, roughly every 5 or 6 years, and it is through these reauthorizations that the federal government can develop new guidelines that the states must follow in order to receive the grant money. The most important component of ESEA is Title I, which uses formulas such as the number of students who receive free or reduced price lunch in order to determine how much money the states and local districts get. Since the passage of the ESEA, the federal government has spent more than $400 billion to help educate children from disadvantaged backgrounds. One of the major reauthorizations of the ESEA was the Improving America's Schools Act, or the IASA of 1994. Now, this was the first federal law that focused on implementing standards-based education throughout the nation, which was really a precursor to No Child Left Behind. It created a new framework for the federal government in public education by not only continuing to provide money for disadvantaged students, but by extending federal support to states' implementation of local and state standards-based reform. So again, sort of like as a precursor to No Child Left Behind, the IASA focuses on the states developing challenging academic standards and creating assessments for all students that align with these standards, and perhaps most importantly, holding schools accountable for the results. It also increased aid to high poverty schools. And again, many of the requirements introduced by IASA were retained in the more well-known No Child Left Behind Act. So the final reauthorization of ESEA that we're going to talk about, everybody's favorite, No Child Left Behind Act. It was passed in 2001, signed by President Bush. Now, this law, more than anything else, dramatically expanded the federal government's role in education. For the following fiscal year after this law was passed, it increased federal spending on education by 25%, or almost 25%. But so the states were getting more money, but in order to receive this money, there was a lot of new federal requirements and mandates that the states had to follow. And again, it's worth clarifying. Due to constitutional limits, the states did not have to or do not have to follow these guidelines. But if they want the money, then they must. So it's a very powerful incentive for the states to accept all these guidelines. And The most significant change to public education is that in order for the states to receive all this new money, then all public schools must bring every public school student up to state standards in reading and math within a certain period of time, and thus closing the achievement gap that exists based on race, ethnicity, and language. There are numerous titles or components of the No Child Left Behind Act. I'm not going to go through them all. So they just, again, they focus on flexibility and accountability. They focus on state standards, preparing and training teachers, etc. Now, why is this all important? Well, this is important because the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and all of its reauthorizations, including the No Child Left Behind Act, have compelled states to adopt a variety of new policies in order to receive federal money, which in turn has had an enormous impact on the teaching profession in terms of what teachers have to do, both inside and outside their classroom. So areas such as standardized testing, for example, students in New Jersey taking PARCC testing, how teachers are evaluated, the fact that teachers have to attend professional development sessions in public schools, the fact that districts are required to provide graduate school tuition reimbursement, how IEPs are written, funding for supplies in classrooms, the standards that teachers have to teach to and that are an integral part of all our lesson plans, and many other areas. Those are all directly affected by the federal guidelines in No Child Left Behind, which again originated from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.